Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Keith Preston and Anarcho Rain, and we're here to discuss the alt-right. And this will be first part of a three-part series where I discuss the problems with the alt-right. In this first series, I'm going to argue that the alt-right is sort of a misnomer, and that they really have more in common with the modern left than anything we would have historically considered on the right. So for starters, a couple of days ago, the new Marvel film, Black Panther, came out. And predictably, the progressives and the alt-right had their own narratives. The progressives predictably said, Black power, Black people could have done this if they hadn't been colonized and subjugated by the white man. And then the alt-right, said, this is we was Kangs, they're making up a fake history to justify their African-American identity. But here's what's really interesting about the alt-right critique of Wakanda and the Black Panther, is they argue, I think somewhat correctly, that the African-American community, being essentially a diasporic community, has no real identity. And they've been trying to create one. In a way, they don't have one in this way that Ethiopians might have one or Kenyans might have one. But what they fail to understand is that they're doing the same thing, right? White Americans, while we can certainly trace our lineage back in the way that slaves might not be able to, former slaves, is that they're also creating a sort of new identity. And they also engage in their kind of fake history. So instead of we was Kangs in Wakanda, it's like we was Vikings in Asgard. And you see a great similarity there. It's almost like if you just switched Black with white and evil imperialist with Christian, you'd end up with a very conventional alt-right critique of Western Christendom, which seems extremely similar in form and substance to the left-wing critique that we see with the movie Black Panther. And this also gives rise to the idea of we've seen black and Chicano nationalists beginning in the 1960s attempting for some sort of an ethno-state, right? The Chicano nationalists want Aztlan in the Southwest. It's not entirely clear what the Black nationalists wanted theirs. But the alt-right says, well, we're gonna unite on the fact that we're all white. So you could be a pagan, a Southern nationalist, a Christian, an atheist, whatever. But that's going to be enough. But on the face of it, that's just absurd. I mean, did the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam say, yeah, we hate whitey and we love Black people, so let's team up to bring down, the white evil patriarchy and create a Black ethno-state? Well, no, they didn't do that. They ended up having internal discord amongst themselves. And the Chicano nationalists failed as well, spectacularly. And I was reading one article written by a Chicano nationalist asking why we failed. And he says they failed specifically because Hispanics are not a monolithic group. They're very diverse. And that's in part why the Democrats and the left failed to predict that Trump would win a majority of Hispanics more than any previous Republican. And we've already seen how this movie ends. The movie ends with people uniting on something very superficial. They then fall to infighting and don't anywhere come near close to accomplishing their goals. So it is strange that the alt-right is really walking in the footsteps of Black and Chicano nationalists. But in fact, they're not even as successful. I mean, at least the Black Panthers achieved the level of a domestic terrorist group that was a credible threat that, the FBI was watching them. After Charlottesville, the alt-right is more of a laughingstock than a threat. So I guess to sum up my opening is that their entire outlook is essentially a white version of Black power. What would you say about that, Keith?
Well, as long as I have observed this modern white nationalist movement that we have at present, and not so much the kinds of white nationalism that existed in the past, like not the pre-civil rights white nationalism, and not even the stuff that came out of the 80s, the skinheads and Aryan nations and all that, but the modern white nationalist movement, which the alt-right is sort of an expression of in many ways. The problem, as long as that tendency has been around, or those collections of tendencies have been around, I've always looked at it like it would probably go in the same direction as the kinds of identity politics that you see on the left have gone, in the sense that I always thought that as demographic change has happened in the United States and continues to happen, where the people of European ancestry become smaller in number, that it was very likely that some kind of white identity politics would evolve in response to that. I always thought it was quite possible that that would happen. And that, in fact, that does seem to be happening. That seems to be happening now in the more mainstream political culture, at least on an implicit level. But I always thought that as that happened, as a white identity politics developed, it would increasingly start to look like the identity politics you find on the left, and in the sense that you would have all the same kinds of differences. You would have a more mainstream white identity politics that was very similar to the kinds of identity politics you have in the Democratic Party. You would have white identity politics just like you have black identity politics and feminist identity politics and gay identity politics and Hispanic identity politics and Jewish identity politics. And then on the margins, you would also see the rise of forms of identity politics that would be more extreme and in many ways more cultic and more esoteric in some of their views. Just like among the black nationalists, you have the Afrocentrics, you have the Black Panther types, you have the Nation of Islam, you have the Yahweh ben Yahweh cult, and there's a whole range of groups like that. You have the Black Israelites, who are similar to Christian identity, only for black people. And that seems to be the kind of direction that the alt-right is, or the white nationalists, either one, however you want to phrase it, are going as well on the margins. I'm starting to see more and more things. It's always been there, but I'm starting to see more and more ideas being floated around in white nationalists and alt-right circles that are virtually the mirror image of the things like that you find among black nationalists and among the more fringe identity politics groups on the left, the really extreme Amazon feminists and all of that kind of stuff. And I suspect the end game of this will be that as the demographic transformation of the United States continues, that and everyone becomes a minority. White people are a minority, Christian people are a minority. All these traditionally majority groups become a minority. You'll see the same kind of thing on the right, the so-called what's now thought of as the right, as you do on the left. You'll have a mainstream identity politics, and that's more watered down, and then you'll have more fringe identity politics that have all these kinds of bizarre and exotic ideas, and that's exactly the direction that the alt-right seems to be moving in.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Anarcho?
Right. So I believe white identity is an inherently leftist I believe that I see this, and I see this as evidenced by recent Bernie Sanders campaign with who's a self-styled democratic social democrat, whichever term he chooses to go with. But he, first off, did amazingly bad with racial minorities compared to Clinton, as he styled politics that are mostly popular in predominantly white nations. And I think this was the first clue to me that the alt-right was really just carrying water for the old left, only with a new racial sheen, because looking at the origins of the old left, beginning with White Man's Burden, which is a very leftist appeal in the 19th century for the civilized white people to spread progressive values to the hopelessly ignorant savages of the African and Asian countries. The alt-right seems to be, while it seems to be stepping away from that strain of the old left, it's really carrying water for a more nationalist interpretation, a more hands-off approach to foreign policy in many circles. It's a little vague, but basically the alt-right is essentially just a more passive version of the old left, which viewed white civilization in a very simplistic and very in a very paragon style.
Yeah, another point, I'm glad you brought up the old left, because really the old left, the sort of left that you would have imagined from, say, 1890 to maybe to the dawn of World War II, we see was actually, and this has been admitted by people on Countercurrents and other alt-right publications, was fairly racially aware. Jack London was a radical socialist on one hand, and also a race realist, as were the sort of like leading lights of American progressivism, people like Lothrop Stoddard, Madison Grant, Margaret Sanger, the great feminist. Even in the UK, H.G. Wells and Brentford Russell sort of had this white man's burden view of the British Empire, and through eugenics and the benevolent white man, they could lift up the subjects of the British Empire. And this was sort of like between like 1900 and 1930, the sort of like cultural milieu of the Anglosphere. We'll see, like in F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby, he creates a character which is an amalgamation of the names Stoddard and Goddard, named Goddard, who's quoting from, or at least expressing ideas found in The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant and The Rising Tide of Color by Lothrop Stoddard. And that was just kind of like the hip, cool, chic thing to do at the time. And another thing is there's a little-known book written called The Red Napoleon by Floyd Gibbons. He was a World War I correspondent. And he writes about a Mongolian chieftain who usurps the Soviet Union and then attempts to conquer the world and amalgamate everybody into a brown people. Sort of wonder if he was aware of the Kalergi plan in all of this. But the whole premise is that the Americans are like the last stand of the white man. And really, the alt-right would be indistinguishable from the old left if they went into a time machine and showed up in 1920. These sort of like urbanite East-West Coast types would have seen him as one of them. I mean, Sanger went to Klan rallies. So in many ways, the alt-right is just going through what maybe a 30, 40-year period the left had went through 100 years ago. And if they think that that's going to fundamentally do anything, well, it didn't then. There's no reason to think it will do it now. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, if you turn back the clock about a century and you look at the kinds of positions that were commonly taken by the progressive movement in the early 20th century, the progressives were based on the idea that you could take scientific principles and use those to manage society in a scientific way. And this was also the beginning of the modern public administration state. This idea, not the liberal idea of the state, where the state is there to protect life and property, but the progressive idea of the state, the idea of the activist government that intervenes in society for the purpose of improving society. And if you look at the kinds of positions that progressives took during that time, they were virtually identical to the same positions that modern progressives take on virtually every issue, with the two exceptions being race and probably sexual morals. Like the old-fashioned progressives were not as big on, say, gay or weren't into gay rights or free love or things like that. And they were also racist. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. He was one of the leading political figures associated with progressivism, and yet he also imposed segregation on the civil service system in the federal government. When he was the president, he had a showing in the White House of Birth of a Nation, a pro-Klan silent film. And what's interesting, though, is if you look at the 100-year trajectory since then, what's happened is that the left in the United States, the so-called progressives, a lot of leftists will say, well, you have to make a distinction between progressives and the real left. And what they mean is the difference between progressives and actual socialists and Marxists and all that. And I think that there is a distinction. But what Americans think of as the left is progressives. And the progressives of today essentially have the same basic sets of views as the progressives from that time period, except they've done this about face on race issues, which is interesting. I mean, you could be, someone like Lothrop Stoddard or Madison Grant were very big on environmentalism. A lot of the old progressives were very big on regulating industries and businesses in the name of the public interest, and licensing occupations, and passing all kinds of consumer protection laws and labor laws, and giving women the right to vote. A lot of them were also into alcohol prohibition. Just like today, a lot of progressives are really big into crusading against smoking and sugary food and fatty food and all that kind of stuff. And so progressives at that time period and progressives today largely had the same views, except race. They've done an about face on the race issue. The old progressives were into eugenics. Now, some of them favored compulsory sterilization of people they deemed unfit, things of that nature, as well as favored racial segregation. And so that changed in the mid-20th century. In the mid-20th century, you start to see the progressives doing an about face on race. I think probably because of World War II. It was probably some of the things that happened in World War II. Advocates of eugenics and those kinds of ideas ended up with some egg on their face. So I think they did an about face to try to obscure that or compensate for that in some ways.
Yes, Anarcho, what are your some thoughts?
Oh, I would like to add. I remember back in my more let's say libertarian phase, I would hear the argument made that even the economic policy too, like say the minimum wage, was specifically advocated for in its inception to keep low-skilled black folks out of the labor force at the expense of other white workers in the same area. So yeah, even the economic policy that progressives advocate for has certain and the thing is, I don't think those arguments made back in those times were wrong either, and I would not actually be surprised if the alt-right have not come to support certain economic policies such as the minimum wage for the express purpose of simply keeping non-whites out of the labor force disproportionately to whites.
Well, you brought up a good point, Keith, about the popularity of eugenics amongst the old left, which we see a resurgence in with the alternative right. We see that in the United States, there were attempts to impose racial hygiene laws. You have that famous statement, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, when they involuntarily sterilized a woman who was deemed mentally unsound. And it's interesting, I'm pretty sure it was in the book War Against the Weak and certain other materials, that the Nazi racial hygiene plan was, of course, the derivative of the sort of progressive Anglo-American racial hygiene plan. And in fact, when Margaret Sanger was running the American Birth Control League, the original name for Planned Parenthood, she spoke quite favorably of those reforms in the 30s, saying that this is exactly what we'd like to see over here, which sure shows you the deep similarity and consistency between the two positions. What are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, the eugenics was a really big part of progressivism from that time period, and a lot of that history has been obscured now. They're starting to dig it up again, and in terms of scholarly research and the discussion of it in history books and all of that. But for a time, that kind of stuff was obscured a bit because of the legacy of that. But it's true that the Nazi Germany based a lot of their racial policies and not just racial policies, but involuntary euthanasia and compulsory sterilization policies on things that had already been tried in the United States. The United States was considered to be a model in many ways that they took and ran with. As far as what was being said earlier about the minimum wage being a tool to keep low-skilled minorities out of the workforce, there were many, many policies like that. One was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was enacted I guess that was in the late 19th or early 20th century, but this is largely a means of excluding Chinese workers from railroad construction on the West Coast. There were also a lot of the early anti-opium laws were passed during that time, would become the prototypes for the modern war on drugs. And that was in part for the purpose of using that as a cover for attacking the Chinese. Also, there was the immigration restriction law that was passed in 1924 when progressives were arguably at the peak of the classical progressives were arguably at the peak of their influence. During that time, the Klan had about 5 million members, which would be more like 15 million members by today's standards in terms of population size. So racism was virulent in the United States in the early 20th century, but this was not considered to be inconsistent with progress or with liberalism or progressivism. You could be a liberal or progressive in good standing and still be an ardent racist. And a lot of it had to do with what was being said earlier about this idea of the white man's burden. Back then, they tended to, educated white elites in the West tended to view people of color as savages that they needed to uplift and civilize and teach Western values to. Now they sort of have a similar paternalistic view, I think, but now they tend to view people of color as being more like children that need to be mentored, into freedom and progress, or they view them, or they have a lot of white leftists, I think, have a view of race that's very similar to the animal rights thing. Essentially, they view people of color as as animals that are being abused. At least they don't put it that way, but it's the language and attitude. If you listen to this stuff carefully, that's what it often sounds like. The alt-right of today really is closely connected with this legacy. And I've had conversations with people from the alt-right where they express exactly these ideas. I had a conversation with an alt-right guy once who said that in the United States, one of the things we needed to do was ban circumcision, male circumcision, and ban the halal food preparation methods, because he figured that would be a way of driving the Jews and the Muslims out of the United States because it would conflict with their religious and cultural practices. And certainly policies like that were enacted 100 years ago, and it was far more socially acceptable to advocate for ideas for those kinds of purposes as well. So the alt-right is a continuation of that tradition in many ways.
Yes, and it's also one that they openly admit they're a part of. In his article, That Old-Time Religion on Countercurrents, Greg Johnson writes, one of the ongoing projects of Countercurrents is to document the existence of a racially conscious left, which has included such features as Jack London, Dennis Kearney in California, Rex Fairborn in New Zealand. Strikes me as far more reasonable for white nationalists to hope for a revival of a race-conscious and militant form of living dominant religion than of a medieval form of displaced and dying faith. And a little bit further down, it is possible to believe that liberalism is the best form of society, but only for white people. Because the races are not equal, and therefore there is no hope of them ever becoming that way in some future utopia. So what we see is they openly admit that they are in this tradition. It kind of reminds me of how libertarians like Murray Rothbard will claim that they were in some sense a successor to the American individualists of like Tucker and Spooner fame. And I think to some extent that kind of exercise is what's going on with many of the alt-right. And in so trying to identify with that, they are making the case for us. But I think one other point to make clear as well is by what is meant by right and by the left. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in his Democracy, the God That Failed, Hans Hoppe pretty much gives, I think, the best succinct definition of what tradition is I've pretty much read almost anywhere. And he basically roots it in family, belief in hierarchy and order, belief in the divine God or gods above us, and all these both public power structures and religious power structures that are in the society as a whole. Now, the left has been pointed out by I forget who was the guy that wrote Conscious of a Conservative. It was the Conservative Manifesto. I forget who he was. But he wrote about how the left is always trying to challenge the status quo, challenge accepted orders, and believes in the belief in the perfectibility of man is really the hallmark of the left. And no traditionalist or conservative really believes man is perfectible. And this is where we get the idea of perfection of man through eugenics. We see this a lot with the alt-right. And now eugenics for most of the mainstream left is not seen as a means of perfection. But I think that is one of the key dividing lines that separates someone from the left from someone on the right. And I just don't see anybody on the alt-right, except for a few maybe neo-reactionaries who largely don't exist much anymore, advocating for a return to throne and altar, and if not an established church, at least a more religious and churched society. And I also get the feeling that if the alt-right could just freeze America in the 1920s, they'd probably be pretty happy. They probably wouldn't want to go anywhere else. And of course, the 1920s was the heyday of American progressivism. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that a distinction needs to be made between the neo-reactionaries on one hand and what's going on in the alt-right. A lot of neo-reactionaries don't consider themselves to be part of the alt-right and vice versa. The neo-reactionaries, I think, could make a more reasonable claim to being within the throne and altar tradition, although some of them, like Mencius Mollberg or Kirk, what his real name was, Curtis Yarvin, I think he was not so much a throne and altar traditionalist as much as he was an elitist. He believed in the idea that people who are supposedly more capable should rule society, not necessarily because of tradition, but what I see in a lot of the alt-right milieu today is often what I see in the left and among libertarians as well, and that is you have this fascination with all sorts of esoterica. You have the fascination with medievalism and with ancient Rome and with all the kind of glorification of all these past cultures that were supposed to be so great. It's kind of primordial civilizations and all of that. Weren't the Vikings wonderful? And you see that on the left as well. You see the idea of the noble savage and weren't indigenous societies wonderful, where they lived in perfect equality among genders and in harmony with nature. The romantic views you have of groups like the Vikings among the alt-right is similar, I think, in another way. The thing is, though, a lot of alt-right people seem to me to not understand that in these older traditional societies that they think were so great, most of them would have been peasants or slaves. They wouldn't have been kings. It's the same way the Afrocentrics have this idea, we were kings or whatever. Well, no, you weren't. I mean, that was one or two people and the rest of you were slaves. And I see this kind of romanticization of the past, the past that never was, coming along on the alt-right as well. It's the same kind of noble savage idea, only from the other end of the ideological spectrum, but it's a very similar way of thinking. As far as how do we go about defining left and right, I think you can define left and right in different ways. There are some people who say that the left is more about modernization and technological development, economic development, whereas the right is more about stasis and resisting change and things like that. I think that's one way to define the right and left. Another is the debate between equality and hierarchy. Like the right tends to believe that hierarchy is natural and unavoidable, and the left tends to champion equality as a primary value. I've heard some people argue that you can associate with the right with a belief in the transcendent or a belief in religion or divinity, and whereas the left tends to be more secular and science-oriented. And probably all of these are reasonable ways of defining the difference between left and right, because they tend to interconnect with each other in a lot of ways. But in that sense, though, I'd say that the alt-right is generally comparable to certainly for modern progressives, if not the left, as opposed to throwing an ultra-traditionalism in any ways. All the way to the point of, romanticizing primordial societies as some kind of, noble utopia and things like that. So I think you're probably right about that.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, Keith, because what they'll do is they'll sort of idolize these almost like prehistoric white Indo-European tribes, the Indo-Aryans that conquered the Harappa civilization in the Indus, thousands of years ago. We have very little records about them. Or the people that, conquered. We don't know much about these people at all, but there's these vast alt-right, theories about them. But the guy that I was talking about, that was Russell Kirk, and the conservative mind. And here's 5 points he brings out about what the left is: the perfectibility of man and the immutable progress of society. Well, that's a check for the alt-right. Contempt for tradition. We'll get into this more in the second video, but I see that a lot too. They tend to be anti-Enlightenment, anti-Christian, and in many regards anti-Hellenistic. Political leveling, maybe not. Economic leveling, definitely. They don't respect the ancient rights and privileges of Europe. So, and to be honest, neither did Hitler, right? Even amongst the German socialism that he was going to inhabit, there was this level of egalitarianism amongst the Germans, the Nordic races. So on all 4 of these points that Kirk gives of what he identifies as the left, the alt-right checks out 3, if not 4 out of 4. And I think that's a pretty good rubric for determining what's on the right scale, what's on the left scale. What were your thoughts, be, Anarcho?
I think this kind of goes back to what I think Utah told me, that if you believe in evolution, then that makes you to some extent on the left. And I think I've actually come to agree with you to that because especially when you consider movements like the alt-right to be very intensely focused on evolutionary concepts such as race realism and the corresponding white identity, and when you mix it in with the striving for equality, then because what I see the alt-right doing is, while they'll say there's inequality between races, what their ultimate goal is, and I believe this does come from their views on evolution, the idea that you can change man's nature, particularly in a very short amount of time, then if we were to create these ethno-states, then it would be the perfect platform to drive this sort of this progressive search for sort of the great white man who will and the thing is, they're not on the far left, so of course there's not going to be complete equality, but there will be this strive to make the greatest of the white race rule the rest of the white race. So
yeah. One of the things you made me think of was what you'll see is, not all, but a lot of people on the alt-right will say that, okay, we object, because recently there's been a lot of debates about civic nationalism between alt-right thinkers and, I guess you could say, most skeptic community from yesteryear that was famous for attacking creationists and later feminists. And now apparently they're going at it with the alt-right on this issue. And the alt-right will tend to say, you can go like Red Ice Radio or something, or Red Ice TV, and they'll say, well, we don't like to have all these people mixed up because we're going to lose our unique genetic identity. And I'm like, okay, if that's the value judgment you're going to make here, then you have to be against French and German nationalism, because before 1789 there was no French person. There were Gascons and Burtons and Normans. A Frenchman was merely someone who was loyal to the French king. So what you've done is you've amalgamated distinct people and diluted their genetic identity. So if the dilution of a genetic identity is bad, then you shouldn't even be for French or German nationalism. And if we take this all the way to its conclusion, you shouldn't even have two people, even of the same tribe, mixing because they have a unique genetic blueprint. And what this creates is this sliding scale of arbitrary stopping points. I mean, if you're going to accept French and German nationalism, then why not accept, universal one worldism? And if you're going to reject it, then why not reject Franco-German nationalism? And all you end up with is a kind of nihilism based on the application of force. And again, this is something we see quite a lot with the left. They can't seem to create a consistent, non-arbitrary standard of measurement. We see this with the communists especially. And what they then do is they then use force to arbitrate this standard, to just say, well, fine, we're just going to cut the Gordian knot with the sword and tough noogies. But this is something that we don't see as much on the right, because if we look at, like, say, the throne and altar societies, there was a more internally consistent application of principles. What would your thought on that be, Keith?
Yeah, when it comes to the idea of amalgamation of people of different ethnic backgrounds and the idea that that needs to be opposed because it somehow eradicates distinct genetic lines or something like that, that's very much a modern idea, obviously. Traditionally, during the throne and altar period, the old royal dynasties and royal empires tended to be very cosmopolitan. That was certainly true of Rome, for example, but it was also true of the traditional European dynasties. What you often had in those systems were people of different ethnic backgrounds, different languages, all kinds of differences, and they would be united by the fact that they were part of this royal dynasty, this empire, or whatever that's ruled by this particular house, or things like that. So that's really what a traditional society is. I mean, a traditional society is royalty, or aristocracy, the established religion, whatever it is, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism in India or something, and a stratified society where everyone has their place, and stasis. There's great resistance to change. I mean, that's what being a true reactionary is. I tend to say that all modern political philosophy is largely on the left, because I think everything from John Locke onward is certainly on the left. You have prototypes for the modern left and right in ancient philosophy, in Greece and in Chinese political philosophy from the ancient world, and in bits and pieces of medieval tendencies within medieval Christendom, and theological tendencies. You have prototypes as well, but modern political ideologies, I think, starting with classical liberalism, so really starting with starting with John Locke, I think are all part of what makes the modern left, because all of that is based on this idea of opposing the traditional order. The traditional order is the throne and altar system, and Lockean liberalism wanted to chip away at that and replace it with things like rule by the merchant class and separation of church and state and things like that. And then that idea expanded over time, and then you started seeing things like universal suffrage. Everyone has the right to vote. Women's suffrage. Then the labor movement, the working class and workers' rights, and slavery abolition. All of these kinds of things go all the way back to classical liberalism. So it's a bit difficult to say that you are on the right if you reject the if you accept any part of that, if you accept any part of what's modernity or classical liberalism leftward. And in fact, I remember having a conversation with a man once who was very well known and widely admired on the alt-right. I was speaking with him at a conference, and he was talking about how he read one of my books, and he says, well, I didn't know you really thought of yourself as a leftist. And I said, well, everybody to the left of John Locke, or beginning with John Locke onward, is a leftist. All modern political philosophy is leftist. I mean, you guys may not agree with that, but I think
would.
You probably would.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the alt-right, given you could argue that things like fascism and National Socialism are not part of the left, in the sense that they're more of a revolutionary right, in the sense of as opposed to a traditional right. That's a position Paul Gottfried takes. Now, there are other conservatives as well as libertarians who don't agree with that, who argue that those ideologies are part of the left, and certainly they share certain things in common with the left, like they're anti-liberal, but they're also modernist. They are scientistic. They are progressive. They are rationalist oriented. They tend to be secular or even anti-clerical. So there is some parallels between fascism and National Socialism and the left as well. But obviously the alt-right admires a lot of those ideas, a lot of these interwar era revolutionary right-wing ideas, which in many ways were hybrids of the left and right, or a type of revolutionary right that was anti-traditional but more futuristic. Italian fascism was big on the futurists and all of that kind of stuff.
So I guess in many ways, those interwar right-wingers are the first transhumanists almost, or something. But one of the things...
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that the transhumanists and the eugenicists have a lot of similar views. I think they actually have this idea of improving the human species through science and technology and things like that.
Yeah. Another thing that also needs to be pointing out is the very idea of nationalism in its modern iteration is essentially a communist ideology. It's the result of the French Jacobin Revolution in 1792. So, you had equality and liberty and fraternity, but nationalism, most scholars admit, begins with the French Revolution. And with nationalism, we also see a kind of egalitarianism, at least within those that are defined in the nation. So, right, within the French nation under the Directory, there was a theoretical, though not actual, equality, just as there was a theoretical but not actual equality in the Soviet Union. And then we see this carried over into the Nazi era when they use nationalism much the same way. And so nationalism is itself a kind of leveling left-wing ideology, because as you pointed out earlier, Keith, that these older societies, whether they were merchant republics like the Dutch or the Italian city-states, or the Phoenicians, or empires like Rome and Macedon and Persia, or if not multi-ethnic, at least not close to the idea. And a lot of these societies correctly viewed French nationalism and later nationalist movements as very, very divisive and very threatening. And in fact, they often end up working together against the same threat, because I forget who he collaborated with, but Carlos the Jackal, the famous Cold War international left-wing terrorist, there was a Nazi terrorist he worked with during that period as well. I don't remember his name. Do you, Keith?
A Nazi terrorist?
Yeah, someone who had connections with the Nazis.
You mean like the... No, I wouldn't be able to think of that right off.
But what's interesting, though, is that these nationalist groups, and of course, communism itself is very nationalistic when you actually think about it, especially third world nationalism. You got like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, you got Frantz Fanon in Algeria. There's the strong nationalist bent. And also, given that we've seen the nationalism in the sort of, I guess you could say, ethno-white nationalism in the progressive United States and United Kingdom, and the continued nationalism of perceived minority groups by the left today, there doesn't really seem to be anything to recommend the idea of nationalism qua nationalism as anything other than on the left. Would you agree, Keith?
Yeah, well, an issue that I have always had with nationalism, it's interesting because a lot of leftists, particularly the left anarchists, are always attacking me as somehow being a nationalist. And I suppose I get where that's coming from, because they don't like the fact that I'm associated with a lot of alt-right people or have been. But the problem I always saw with nationalism and with racialism is just the arbitrariness of it all. It's about this idea that you somehow have some affinity with some person based on very superficial and shallow characteristics, like having been born on the same landmass or having the same skin color. I mean, there has to be more than that to form the basis of any kind of community or human relationships. When it comes to family, that's a little bit different, because these are actual people that you have not only biological kinship with, but personal kinship with, developed over a lifespan, or community, or people who share the same value system, like, say, church or some sort of ideological movement or something like that. It's always seemed seem to me that identity of that kind is in many ways more reasonable than something like race or nation. Now, you can also have this idea, well, what about people who are being oppressed or whatever, or being attacked on the basis of race and nation, or, and that's certainly the leftist identity politics is rooted in claims of having been oppressed, and the white nationalism is the same way. We're being oppressed by the Jews, or political correctness, or leftism, or liberalism, or something. But it's a very reactive point of view. I don't think in the long run that leftist identity politics is going to be anything other than a reaction against the traditional WASP society, because I don't really see any common threads to leftist identity politics, and by extension to white nationalist identity politics that would be the basis for an actual society. I don't really see any shared values or shared culture or goals or personal relationships beyond we don't like these people over here, and that's about it. I think Todd, you recently pointed out an article by Jack Donovan where he's talking about how white nationalists agree on nothing. They don't agree on religion, they don't agree on economics, they don't agree on international relations, they don't agree on the Jewish question, they don't agree on who's white and who's not. They don't agree on homosexuality, all these other things. Well, if you don't agree on any of these things, you're not going to have very much in the way of this homogenous ethno-state that these guys envision. They have this idea, we're going to have this white ethno-state. It's going to be up just for white people, white unity. And you're going to have in this, pagans and communists and Christian evangelicals and
feminists,
feminists and libertarians and anarcho-capitalists. It's and this is going to be the basis of some peaceful, harmonious society where we're not going to have all this conflict like we have now with a multiracial society. And I don't really see that turning out that way. And I think that's true of the left as well. The one thing that unites the left in the United States is being against the traditional WASP culture. That's what really the common thread. But once the traditional WASP culture is no longer seen as a threat because it's been dwindled to the status of a minority culture, then you're going to see all the different constituent groups on the left turning on each other. You're going to see, the different ethnic groups and sexual groups and feminists and socioeconomic and occupational groups, all of that. You already see that to some degree. And that's going to get more pronounced over time as well. But the alt-right is the mirror image of the left in that sense, and that it's all about this, we have this identity based on who we don't like, even though we agree on nothing and have nothing in common, except for some of these very superficial characteristics, and then this mythology that we've embraced, the noble Viking savage or whatever.
Yeah, and we've already seen this movie before with the black nationalists and the Chicano nationalists. It doesn't really pan out. But I guess, Anarcho, what are your thoughts on some of these topics we've been mentioning just now?
One thing I would say is that if I had to make one argument as to how nationalism could be considered right-wing, relatively speaking, obviously we can draw the line at any point and say what is right and left from this point of view. I would argue that anything post even further than John Locke, you could say that everything that at a certain point then that everything has been left. But if we're to consider nationalism at least in contrast to one of the larger intellectual cliques that we see on the left with secular humanism, at stark contrast to each other, because the natural conclusion to humanism is communism. If your highest goal is humanity and the human race, then the open borders is sort of the natural conclusion you would reach for that, unless you prioritize, the state, the liberal state, as your highest goal. But the thing is, so the alt-rights, I would say, is third positionist in that way, in that it's unlike the far left or the anarchists. They're not advocating for the elimination of all identity, but as you said, because they need all of these different ideological groups, religious groups, and racial groups to all form together. They're not, they're in that sense not able to reach the more traditional throne and arc societies, or even like you don't even need to go that traditional, just like something that mirrors that sort of power structure, away from modernist, democratic, capitalist government nations. The alt-right needs to pull away from that standard in order to get all of these different groups that don't really like each other or want to be each other, put all that aside to embrace, what they consider to be sort of the defining political and cultural trait, which is race.
Well, yeah, I mean, you did bring up something that I do want to challenge slightly here, Anarcho, is that I do think, well, it may not be intentional, though in some cases I think it is. The alt-right is actually very anarchic. I remember when it got started around 2011 up through 2013, if you read like the various drama, those unfolding on blogs and websites, there was lots of talk about purging people from the alt-right, people that didn't pull their weight or didn't fit in. And to some extent, to have a cohesive political revolutionary movement, you do need a purge. I mean, Hitler purged the brown shirts, Lenin purged the Mensheviks, and you hear all across the alt-right, no, there's no purge. Nobody's the leader. Our strength is that we don't have a leader. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember that, but I heard that all the time in that time period. And this is just straight up anarchism.
Yeah.
This is not not even revolutionary Hitler or revolutionary Lenin. And I think what we see this is a reflection of the individual libertarian values of America itself. The alt-right professes to hate those values, and maybe they really do, but they've done very little to transcend them and organize in any meaningful sense, in the way that even like the Panthers could organize, or the Weather Undermen could organize. So what are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, the way you talk about how they are American, in many respects, what that reminded me of is I once saw where a critic of Murray Rothbard said that this was someone, a conservative, a foreign policy conservative, who was criticizing Murray Rothbard for not, for being too soft on communism or something like that. But he was saying that Murray Rothbard's libertarianism was so American that he hated America for not being American enough. And I think there was probably something to that. The thing is, the alt-right seems to me to have some contradictory views on this as well, because on one hand, they say, well, they accept this European conservative critique of Americanism as sort of a liberal degeneration of European civilization. But this whole idea of white nationalism is more American than European. In Europe, even today, among nationalists, you have nationalists who think of themselves as British, French, Italian, German, Spanish, Polish, and Hungarian, whatever, and that means something to them. Whereas it's more the American white nationalists who have this kind of pan-white idea of race. I mean, even the Germans, even Hitler was a Germanophile, and they had their issues with the Dutch and with the British and with the French and with lots of other ethnic groups as well, nationalities. So this kind of pan-white racialism is fairly distinctively American in many ways, because of the fact that America is this ethnic melting pot of all these different European ethnic groups. The single largest white ethnic group in the United States are German Americans, but you don't really have a lot of people running around saying, yeah, I'm a German American. And then, America really is this kind of melting pot of European ethnicities, that has this kind of amorphous, just blanket white identity to it, and which in some ways is defined by not being black or not being Hispanic or something like that. And that, I think, is to a large degree what the alt-right is. That's the kind of white nationalism that they tend to promote. That it's not the kind of, in fact, a lot of them will call the traditional European nationalism, they'll call it petty nationalism. They'll, like the ones that are critical of Hitler, they'll say, well, he was a petty nationalist. He was too fixated on the German thing, or they'll talk about even today how, in fact, I saw a lecture once by a very well-known person in the alt-right who said that, a lot of the Europeans, they just need to get their act together. They're arguing too much about Poles versus Hungarians versus Germans versus Romanians, and they need to. In fact, he even called it ethnophobia. It sounds like a leftist term. Ethnophobia. He was saying, they need to unite under the European banner. But again, how's that any different from the left-wing idea of the universal citizen? It's just a less extreme version of the same idea. And so I don't see this as really being, again, the problem I have with all of this is I don't see it really being the basis for a movement that would ever be politically influential, because it has no direction. I mean, there are really no points of agreement in terms of what they want to achieve. And if you look at, it's interesting, I think, to compare the alt-right with other movements. It's really interesting to compare the alt-right with the religious right. The religious right since the 70s has been, was a much larger movement than the alt-right has ever been. Certainly more influential, certainly more money for organizing and things like that. And yet the religious right also had a clearer picture of what it is they wanted to do, and it was more reform oriented than revolutionary. It was more about they wanted to repeal the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision, or they wanted to put prayer back in public schools, or they wanted to oppose recognition of gay marriage. And they failed on virtually every one of these things, even with some fairly simple, clearly defined mainstream goals. And being a much larger movement. And I don't even see the alt-right really even having anything on that along those lines. Maybe the thing that comes closest would be restricting immigration. Although they'll say, well, we only want to restrict immigration for the non-white people. They'd probably be okay to say Russian immigration or European immigration. And I don't see that as being the basis for any kind of successful political program that's ever going to have enough appeal to actually influence state policy and things like that.
Yeah. Well, we're about at the end of time. So first, Anarcho, do you have any last words you'd like to leave us with?
I think the alt-right has a fairly short lifespan left, primarily based on the fact that it's trying to play the same identity politics that the left is, and because it's essentially doing the same thing only for white people, it's going to have the same problems, and the consequence will be its own irrelevance.
Okay. Keith, do you have any final words?
Well, I tend to agree with that. I think that the alt-right is a backlash in many ways against certain things. In fact, a criticism I have of the direction that the alt-right has gone in is that it's become the mirror image of their enemy. It's kind of like the slogan, you become what you hate, or whatever. When I've been around the alt-right as long as it's been in existence. Even before that, when the alt-right terminology started being used, that's when I was writing for the original alternativeright.com webzine that Richard Spencer started some years ago, probably about 8 years ago. And I used to write for Takis before that, when Richard was editing that, and with the Mencken Club, out of that circle, the Paul Gottfried and all that, the term alternative right began. So it's been about 10 years now since this movement began, and I haven't really seen any progress that I think is really all that positive. If anything, it seems to be a degeneration over time. And I predicted this would happen. I predicted that the alt-right, when it started, it tended to be a more highbrow intellectual movement that was interested in European conservatism, or interested in figures like Alain de Benoit, and all of that. And over time, it's become increasingly lowbrow and comedy oriented and cruder in terms of its racial animosity and things like that, and also more openly embracing neo-Nazism and things of that nature as well. And I think that's certainly been a deterioration. But I see it as being a backlash or reaction against the things that it opposes. It's sort of like social justice warriors for the right or Antifa for the right. And it's starting to become a mirror image of that. In fact, a lot of people I know from those circles, from the alt-right circles, some of whom I've known for years, I've noticed increasingly they're adopting the kind of shrill, hysterical rhetoric that you see coming from the from the social justice warriors or from the Antifa. It's like the mirror image, even if they're politically polar opposites. And I don't really see that as anything that's going to be the foundation for building a movement that changes society. That's the problem I see with it. I don't see this as being regardless of whether you agree with their goals or not, or whatever the goals are, I don't see this as being a movement that's really going to be able to break out into the mainstream and actually influence public policy or state policy in a long-lasting way.
Yeah. Well, thank you coming on, Keith and Anarcho. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.